Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back to the podcast. I am thrilled to be here with all of you as always. I have been asking all of you to leave a review and a rating if that's something that's calling you. So I just want to put that out there again. If this is something that's calling to you, I would love for you to leave a rating of the podcast. You can pause right now, leave a rating and a review of maybe your favorite takeaway from the last episode or today's episode. But the reason why I'm asking is it really helps the algorithm and it helps other people find us. It helps me help more people. So I really appreciate if you could help me with that. All right, let's just jump right in. I want to talk about guilt today because you all know I work with a ton of different variety of people. I work with global leaders all over the world managing billion-dollar contracts. I work with PhDs in sociology. I work with physicians. I work with lawyers. And all of my clients have so many common threads. And, we would think people are so different, but the truth is we all have a ton of common threads. And one that I see show up over and over again, especially for my clients who identify as women, or if you were raised in a home with a lot of religion growing up, is the narrative of guilt. So, I want to talk about guilt today and hopefully give you some tools to help you overcome the guilt. Guilt is really interesting. And I want to start by just sharing something that you may not want to hear, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that's this, that no one is going to help you feel less guilty. I had a client who said she felt so guilty because of XYZ. And what was going to help her feel better is if they told her she did the right thing or that, she didn't do anything wrong. And it's so interesting because the truth is that no one can really make you feel less guilty. That's sort of an inside job. That's a problem that you get to solve for yourself. And, the thing about guilt is that there's really two big types of guilt if we were going to put them in buckets. There's rational guilt and irrational guilt. And we're going to dive deeper into that in a little bit. But rational guilt is the normal guilt that we're all supposed to feel. It's the guilt that keeps us sort of in line with our moral code and in line with our tribe to make sure we don't get kicked out of our tribe. And not having that type of guilt, there are people that don't have it. There are people that have been diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder or narcissism, and they won't feel that type of guilt. But the majority of humans walking around this planet, if you're a good human with a good heart, you're going to feel guilt. So there's no way to get rid of guilt completely, but there are good ways to manage it so that we don't ruminate over guilt because there's nothing wrong with feeling guilt. The problem comes when you stay in the guilt for too long and then it no longer serves you. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about guilt. Okay, so guilt shows up, especially rational guilt. Rational guilt shows up when we feel like we are betraying our moral code, our rules of our ethical behavior. Are we in integrity with ourselves? That's a really good question that I'd love for you to ask yourself next time you're feeling guilty. Am I in integrity? If the answer is yes, then you've got to really question that guilt showing up because it's probably not rational guilt. It's likely irrational guilt. So, this type of guilt shows up when we are we're pushing against our own moral code. But if, however, unconsciously you have been affiliated with sort of these standards of you should feel guilty for certain things, you will be more vulnerable to irrational guilt. So let's talk a little bit about irrational guilt and how it shows up. So, guilt can be sort of a behavior that we learn from mimicking people around us. So it's the same thing, if you grow up in a house, for example, where you had a parent who was always kind of wailing about things being their fault. It's always my fault or it's always their fault. You might have learned, again, remember between 0 and 10 years old is when we experience the most neuroplasticity. So that's when we get the most programming in our brains. You may have learned that guilt is a way for you to get attention. So maybe you constantly have to create that feeling in other people so that you get attention for yourself. Or you may have learned that the only way to show that you care is by feeling guilty. I had a client, brilliant, brilliant woman. She was a successful entrepreneur. She was a mother of three. She was also a physician. Brilliant woman, raised in a home where her example, her parent, was always expressing a ton of guilt, like self-sacrificing all the time. And that's what she thought she needed to do to show that she cared. And so she came to me because she was incredibly burnt out because she was always self-sacrificing all of the time. So if you had a parent that was always going off about how they constantly sacrificed everything for you, then you might be programmed to believe that in order for you to show that you care, you need to sacrifice too. Or you may have been programmed to believe that everything is your fault, which of course causes you to experience higher levels of guilt. And there's a lot of religions also that teach that you should experience guilt, or that guilt is how you know that you're going against the religious code. And so, if you were raised in a home where there was a lot of religion, you will also experience a tremendous amount of guilt. I had another client, and this is not unique to the Catholic religion. She just happens to be Catholic, but this is unique to many religions. But in her religion, what she grew up learning is that guilt showed that she was in tune to caring and that she wasn't being selfish. And she would feel guilty for everything. She would walk around her house. If the dishes weren't done, she'd feel so guilty that the dishes weren't done. If her kids didn't have a healthy vegetable for their lunch for one day over the week, she'd feel super guilty that she was a bad mom. And on and on and on. If she didn't work out, she would feel super guilty. Guilt was just her go to emotion for everything. And that's really important for us to recognize because that is irrational guilt. We're not going against a moral code, but it's just programmed into our brain. And it is such a fast thought to feeling connection that it's just hardwired and programmed into us to feel guilt for almost anything. Okay, so let's continue this thread of irrational guilt. So, this sense of irrational guilt follows this thought pattern or this limiting belief that you are responsible for someone else's suffering, for someone else's misfortune. And that thought, when it becomes irrational, is when it's not true. Whether it's true or not true, you believe that you are responsible for someone else's suffering. So if you experience guilt on a chronic basis, for example, like one of my clients, uh, one of the things that you may be suffering is you might have the illusion that you are responsible for causing other people's harm. For example, you might think it's your fault that someone doesn't have enough to eat. So you go out to a fancy restaurant and then you feel guilty for eating at a fancy restaurant. Or you see, a panderer on the street asking for money, you feel guilty. You see a homeless person on the street, you feel guilty. So it doesn't really follow logic because how can you be responsible for the pain and suffering of the world? That's completely irrational, but it's something that has been ingrained in you if you consistently feel guilt. Now, there's also this type of guilt for something you didn't even do. You haven't done it yet, but maybe you thought about it. For example, you had a thought about having a sexual experience with someone else that's not your partner. So, cheating on your partner. And just the thought itself goes against your moral code, which causes you to feel guilty. Now, denying that that thought exists is not going to help you. In fact, like Carl Jung says, what you resist will persist. So you're going to continue to have that thought and you're going to continue to go down the spiral of feeling really guilty when you have these types of thoughts. Now, a really practical way to solve for this is to, first of all, just acknowledge the thought exists. And just having a thought doesn't mean you're going against your own moral code or your integrity. Notice the thought exists, especially these types of thoughts that have been shamed out of us, any kind of sexual thoughts or things like that. Notice the thought exists. Acknowledge that you're thinking it. I had this thought. Okay, well, I don't think I'm the only human being that has these thoughts. There's probably tons of human beings out there. And I'm clearly not taking action on it because that's not actually something I want to do. It's just a thought I had. That by itself neutralizes the thought and allows you to move past it. So that's guilt for something you didn't do but want to do. There's also guilt for something that you did do. So this falls back under rational guilt. So let's talk a little bit more about rational guilt. So rational guilt is, again, when you're going against your own moral code, you're lying, you're stealing, things like that. Feeling guilt in when you're going against your own moral code is totally normal and we all have it. The problem isn't that you feel it. The problem is when you ruminate over it. Because when you ruminate over it, what you are essentially doing is reliving the guilt over and over and over again. And it's affecting so many other parts of your day. And it can cause a sense of self doubt, insecurity, and so many other things. It's really just stress among stress among stress. So, what do you do in those instances? So, let's talk about how you solve for this type of rational guilt. First of all, identify what you did wrong. Whenever I'm telling myself, or I have at least a thought like, "Ooh, the guilt is starting to keep it for me," because by the way, just a personal story here, I was a chronic guilter. I would chronically feel guilt all of the time because another type of irrational guilt I had, which my sense is many of you had too, is feeling guilty from fear of thinking I'm going to disappoint somebody else. Incredibly guilty. So for those of you that have trouble setting boundaries, or have people pleasing tendencies, this is a big one. This guilt that shows up when you're afraid that you're going to disappoint somebody else or that someone's going to be mad at you also falls under irrational guilt, by the way. So I used to be one of those chronic guilters, and I would always feel guilt around those things. Now, we're going to come back to that irrational guilt in a second, but whenever you feel any type of guilt, the first question you should always pause and ask yourself once you notice the guilt. So for me, what I do is if that creeps in at all, I just pause and I say, I notice that I'm feeling guilty. And then I pause and I say, what did I do? Am I out of integrity? Am I going against my own moral code? Am I out of integrity? And then I wait for the answer. Usually the answer is no. I'm a pretty moral person. I practice integrity. So usually the answer is no, I did not. But if the answer is yes, sometimes if it's yes for you, that's okay. Just notice it and sit with it. And then what you have to do is you have to have the courage to right the wrong, whether that's apologizing, maybe it's apologizing to yourself, maybe it's apologizing to somebody else, maybe it's seeking support if it's something you did that you don't want to do again. But really, what has to happen here is you have to have the courage to forgive yourself, forgive someone else, and or move on. Apologize and or move on. Now, what keeps us stuck here when we did do something wrong, we did go against our own moral code, we were out of integrity. What keeps us stuck here and what keeps us feeling guilt is we think that if we forgive ourselves too fast, we're going to do it again. We think that if we forgive ourselves too fast, that we have not punished ourselves enough. And then it keeps us in this cycle of feeling guilt. Now, just notice that. Notice that thought pattern. It is so mean to hold ourselves hostage from not forgiving ourselves because we're afraid we're going to do it again. Instead, what I would just invite all of you to do is sit with the sense of self-trust and self-integrity and say, it feels really bad what I did. I don't want to do it again. And ask for support. I sometimes ask divine or spirit. I'll say, I need forgiveness for this and I don't want to do it again. Or sometimes I call upon a good friend or my husband sometimes to hold me accountable. Hey, I did this thing. It feels horrible. I don't want to do it again. So I'm saying it out loud because I need that to be witnessed. And I'm giving you permission to hold me lovingly accountable. So there's some options for you. Check in with yourself if you're out of integrity when guilt is showing up. If you are out of integrity, that's okay. Just have the courage to right the wrong. Apologize, forgive yourself, forgive somebody else if you need to do that. Ask for support and have it be witnessed. You have to have it be witnessed so that you can move on. And sometimes the witnessing comes from you yourself. You just say it out loud and you witness it for yourself. Now, when the guilt is irrational, this now is, I think, for most people, because I think 90% of the time when I'm coaching my clients and guilt is showing up for them, the guilt that they're experiencing is irrational guilt. It's guilt from fear that they're going to disappoint someone. It's guilt from fear that they're doing the wrong thing, when really that's all just being stuck to a narrative that's not even true. So when guilt shows up for you again and you check in with yourself, am I out of integrity? And the answer is no, but you can't seem to shake the guilt feeling. Sit with it for a little bit. Sit with it for a little bit and ask yourself, what is underneath this guilt? What am I actually feeling here? Like my one client that would feel guilty for the dishes not being done or her kids not having vegetables or whatever. Check what's underneath that. Oh, I'm feeling really out of balance because I really want my house to be clean. That has nothing to do with guilt. That's not out of integrity. You're not, committing a sin because your house is not clean. But if you want your house clean, then check in with yourself. What is something you can do? Give yourself time to clean the house or hire someone to come in and clean your house if that's what's going to give you that feeling of peace. Beautiful. Do that. That's wonderful. Now, when you just practice the noting part, noticing, I've talked about that a lot here because I think it's a really simple tool of awareness. When you just practice saying to yourself, I notice that I'm feeling guilt, but I'm not out of integrity, and just sit with that for a little bit. Sometimes that by itself helps you shake the guilt. Just witnessing it, noticing it, and bringing your awareness to the fact that you are actually not out of integrity. So again, check in with yourself. Are you in or out of integrity? If you are not out of integrity, ask yourself what's underneath that, because maybe there's something underneath there that's trying to tell you something that's being masked by guilt because guilt is so common for you. If you are not out of integrity, then just witness for yourself, practice noting, practice awareness, and just watch yourself, see what comes up for you. Now, if you were out of integrity, then do what I mentioned in the beginning. Have the courage to right the wrong, witness it for yourself, and forgive yourself so you can move on. All right, sweet friends. The one last thing I want to leave you with is this, that I want to make sure you all know that feeling guilty is part of being a human being. And again, 99% of the time when guilt comes up, it's probably irrational guilt. So just check with yourself when it's coming up. Notice, why do I carry this so much? Where did I learn it from? If this is one of your go to emotions, just notice where you feel it in your body. The more in tune you can get to where you feel it in your body, the quicker you will be at noticing it in the future and allowing yourself to shift out of it, which is really the healthiest thing you can do, because staying stuck in guilt does not serve anybody. It doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve the people around you that you love or that you want to help. And if it is rational guilt, if you are that 1% of the time that you are feeling that guilt because you did do something wrong, that's okay too. Listen, we're all human. We make mistakes. And it's those times that we check back in with ourselves that we notice we were out of integrity. And now we get to get back into integrity, that we learn big life lessons that shape our moral compass. They shape who we are. We all make mistakes. When you decided to, reincarnate onto this earth in a human body, you did not sign some sort of contract that said that you were going to feel great all the time and never make a mistake and never mess up. Absolutely not. We came on this earth, and unfortunately, we have to experience the suffering and the sadness and the mistakes and the guilt to grow, to evolve, to play out the contract that our soul is here to play on this planet, on this earth, in this lifetime. So allow yourselves to experience all of the emotions that come up in life, including guilt. Be with the guilt, learn from it. And the more you can notice the irrational guilt when it shows up, the more you can notice how it feels in your body, the more you can witness that for yourself, the more you can ask yourself, are you out of integrity? And notice that you're not, the more and more you will be able to shift out of feeling chronic guilt. All right, sweet friends. This is our last episode until after the holidays. So I love you all so much. I wish all of you the happiest holidays and the best of the best new year. I might sneak in one more episode. I don't know yet. But if not, I will see you all in 2025. Here's to a fantastic year. Adios.